Hey everybody, it's the new way I'm doing videos. I have a little corner thing here. There's the Bernie Sanders stuff that you always mock me for. So I'm going to be doing my videos both on Monday and Thursday in this little corner. Hopefully I can make everything look and sound better over time, but it's a start. But yeah, besides that, this is your quick step for this week. I'm Tristan, this is Step Back. Welcome home. So, the Step Back subreddit, in which I have a thread I put up and pin every single week in which you can suggest new ideas for quick steps. So, if you want me to talk about something, go and check it out there, reddit.com/r/stepback. And I actually did not get a ton of comments this week, and so I'm going with the highest rated one, which was to talk about NATO. So NATO is an organization that has come up a lot in the news this week, especially after the Helsinki conference between Trump and Putin, which is all sorts of interesting things. Honestly, I think the Russians might have something big on Trump, and it might be bigger than the P-tape, which is totally real, by the way. So what is NATO? Why is Russia so antagonistic towards it, and what's the whole deal? Well, let's get started by explaining what NATO is. It is a mutual defense pact made by and led by the United States in the wake of World War II at the beginning of the Cold War. It began with something called the Treaty of Brussels in 1948, and in many ways is the start of the Cold War. It was an alliance in order to combat the growth of the Soviet Union and their influence on the world. And it got even more attention when in 1950 the Korean War happened, and a lot of the NATO countries realized that the communist countries are working together towards their ends. What they didn't know is just how short that would actually last. And of course, it had its first dissenters pretty quick. France actually withdrew from NATO, or at least backed off its requirements to NATO until 2009, because Charles de Gaulle wanted to have the opportunity to sign an independent peace treaty with East Germany in case a war broke out, so that they wouldn't be involved in an apocalyptic Third World War. However, the main thing that I think that people get angry about is the fact that in 1991, there was no longer a Soviet Union. So NATO, the organization that was started explicitly as a defense against the communist bloc, no longer had a purpose. So why is it still around? That's a question a lot of people are asking these days. Why is there still a NATO? And if anything, it's larger, way larger than it's ever been. Because in 1991, with the whole end of history thing, NATO decided to expand itself into a political and humanitarian bloc. One of the things that happened is that in the 1990s, Russia was really at a low point. The Soviet Union had broken up, and it was led by a Boris Yeltsin, who was not exactly the strongest of leaders, and basically they sold off Russia to oligarchs and basically made every capitulation to the United States that they could do. To the point where in the 1996 election, it's pretty sure that the Americans were intervening with it. And now with the whole thing about Russia trying to interfere with the 2016 election, karma's a bastard, isn't it, America? I don't think that any Russian spy did as much damage as not campaigning in Michigan or Wisconsin, and, dissolving the democratic structure in a lot of the poorest parts of America, because you want to get those rich suburbs. So in the years in the 1990s, the Russians were trying to get themselves back on their feet with a president who was basically trying to sell everything in Russia to the highest bidder. And it led to this really strange oligarchy that exists in Russia today. And so it was inevitable that somebody like Putin, who would take over Russia after Yeltsin, eventually anyway, would have a bone to pick with the way that the world had treated Russia ever since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Putin started with a Russia that had multiple parts of the old Soviet bloc now amalgamated into NATO, and NATO, as an organization that was set up explicitly to target the Soviet Union, maybe left the Russians feeling just a tad threatened. And in their rebound, their reach out for allies, they've tried to counter NATO expansion to regions like, say, Ukraine, for example, and tried to weaken the influence of NATO and the European Union in what the Russians would consider their sphere of influence. which is totally demeaning to the people who live in those countries, and it's kind of the reason the Soviet Union broke up, if you really think about it. But I'm not here to say that the Russians are right. I'm here to say that the Russians are smart. I would not be surprised if Putin's involvement in things like the election of Tayyip Erdogan were to come out, because Turkey is part of NATO, and Erdogan can definitely be part of weakening that. There's, of course, the whole thing with Ukraine and trying to resist Ukraine's integration into the European Union, into NATO. It's all part of Russia trying to play the influence game and try to get itself back into the superpower club when it is much, much weaker than its military opponents. In fact, having a huge military alliance that more or less exists to counter your influence leads you to wonder, how does a country rebound from this? And as we are increasingly figuring out, it is to subvert the democratic process in different countries, like the 2016 election, for example. So in many ways, NATO trying to continue itself is, in a weird way, kind of responsible for the 2016 election having influence from the Russian government. I don't know, that might be a bit too far, but it's an interesting thing to think about. And maybe if Russia did not have all of its assets sold to the highest bidder by a weak president, that the United States had subverted their elections in order to keep in power, who knows? Maybe things would have been slightly different. In fact, maybe if the goal was not to rub salt in the wounds and try to keep the former Soviet bloc as low as possible, you wouldn't have this rise in right-wing nationalism, read fascism, in Eastern Europe happening right now. I don't know. I'm just a guy on the internet. So yeah, that went in a whole lot of directions. I'm not exactly sure if I answered the question about what is NATO in a way that is satisfying, but basically a military alliance made to counter the Soviet Union that persists after the Soviet Union's collapse, basically to be a way to, like the IMF and the World Bank and all sorts of other things, keep establishing the West's cultural, political, and military hegemony over the planet. And it kind of cements that the Cold War really wasn't a war of ideas. This wasn't democracy versus totalitarianism. It was a game of territory, conquest, and influence on both sides. Anyways, that is all for this very quick step this week. If you look down in the description, there is an email list link if you want to sign up for the MailChimp and get videos mailed to your inbox every week, 1 hour before they go live. So if that sounds like your bag, then go and check it out. Or if you just don't like going to YouTube to watch your subscriptions every week, I can just email it to you. Anyways, bye.